If she never calls or texts you first, it's not because she's busy, it's because of something you're unknowingly communicating about your value. And once you understand this, you'll never chase the wrong way again. Stay till the end, because what I'll share today can instantly change how women respond to you. The biggest mistake men make when she never calls or texts first is assuming that effort creates desire. It doesn't. Effort creates availability, and availability without emotional tension creates familiarity, not attraction. When a man notices that he's always the one reaching out, his nervous system goes into panic mode. He starts reading silence as rejection, delay as disinterest, and neutrality as a personal failure. So he reacts by increasing output, longer messages, faster replies, more explanations, more emotional exposure, believing that if she just sees how genuine he is, she'll finally reciprocate. But what actually happens is the opposite. The more he tries to secure connection through consistency alone, the more he signals that he has no leverage, no internal anchor, no life pulling him forward independent of her response. Attraction isn't built on reassurance, it's built on polarity. And polarity dies the moment one person is chasing clarity while the other is still deciding how they feel. Another layer of this mistake is emotional overtranslation. When she doesn't initiate, many men immediately narrate a story in their head. I'm not enough. She's losing interest. I must fix this. That internal story leaks into behavior. Texts become anxious, timing becomes reactive, tone becomes heavy. Instead of being a grounded presence, the man becomes an emotional thermometer, constantly checking her temperature, adjusting himself to her moods, centering his actions around her validation. Women are deeply intuitive about emotional states, and even if she can't articulate it, she feels the imbalance. She senses that the interaction is being driven by fear of loss rather than enjoyment of connection. That energy doesn't inspire initiation. It makes initiation feel like responsibility, and desire never grows where obligation is present. The mistake deepens when men confuse communication with connection. They believe that staying in constant contact keeps attraction alive, when in reality, attraction needs space to breathe. Emotional connection grows in the gaps between conversations, between meetings, between moments of attention. If you're always there, always filling silence, always checking in, there's nothing for her imagination to do, no curiosity to resolve, no emotional pull to act on. When she knows your message regardless, her nervous system relaxes into passive reception. She doesn't need to reach out because the connection is already being maintained without her contribution. This dynamic slowly trains her to associate you with comfort, not excitement, reliability, not desire. And perhaps the most damaging part of this mistake is that it teaches the man to abandon his own rhythm. Instead of texting when he genuinely wants to share something meaningful, he texts to prevent distance. Instead of living his life and inviting her into it, he pauses his life to wait for a response. Over time, this erodes self-respect. The man becomes smaller in his own story, orbiting her attention instead of standing firmly at the center of his own purpose. That's when initiation stops entirely, not because she dislikes him, but because there's nothing emotionally unresolved pulling her toward him. Silence is one of the most misunderstood signals in modern dating, especially for men who are emotionally invested. When she doesn't call or text first, the mind rushes to interpret that silence as a verdict, rejection, disinterest, or emotional unavailability. But silence is not a conclusion, it's information. It's raw data that reveals how attraction, comfort, and emotional dynamics are currently structured between two people. The mistake isn't that she's quiet. The mistake is assigning meaning to that quiet without understanding understanding context. Silence doesn't say, I don't care. It says, this is where the balance of effort currently sits. And that distinction is crucial because data can be worked with, while rejection shuts men down emotionally and pushes them into reactive behavior. When a woman doesn't initiate, it often means she feels no internal urgency to do so. Not urgency born from anxiety, but urgency born from curiosity, emotional pull, or the fear of missing out. Human beings act when there is tension between desire and uncertainty. If she already feels emotionally certain that you'll be there, certain that communication will continue, certain that she doesn't need to act to maintain connection, then silence becomes comfortable. Her nervous system doesn't feel compelled to move. That doesn't mean she dislikes you. It means the dynamic has removed pressure from her side and placed it entirely on yours. Silence in this sense is not cruelty or indifference. It's a reflection of who is carrying the emotional momentum. Men often personalize this silence instead of analyzing it. They assume something is wrong with them rather than something is imbalanced in the interaction. This personalization creates emotional urgency, and emotional urgency creates chasing. The moment you chase, you distort the data. You're no longer observing what her silence means. You're trying to overwrite it. And when you overwrite data, you lose clarity. Silence is actually one of the clearest signals you'll ever get because it reveals behavior without words. Words can be polite, reassuring, misleading. Silence cannot pretend. It shows you exactly how much initiative exists on the other side when no pressure is applied. Another reason silence is valuable data is because it exposes emotional investment asymmetry. In healthy dynamics, effort flows naturally back and forth. Initiation doesn't become a scorecard, it becomes instinctive. When silence persists, it shows that emotional energy is flowing in one direction. That awareness is power. It allows a man to make decisions from self-respect rather than confusion. Instead of asking, how do I make her text me? The better question becomes, why am I investing more than the dynamic is currently supporting? Silence invites reflection, not pursuit. It asks you to pause and reassess your role, your pacing, and your boundaries. Most importantly, silence gives you space to reclaim your center. When you stop reacting to it emotionally, you start responding strategically. You notice patterns instead of moments. You observe whether she responds warmly when you do initiate, whether she invests when given room, whether distance increases curiosity or indifference. Silence becomes feedback rather than punishment. And feedback, when interpreted correctly, protects you from overextending, from self-abandonment, from building attachment on uneven ground. The men who grow most attractive are not the ones who fear silence, but the ones who can sit with it calmly, read it clearly, and adjust without resentment or desperation. Over-availability doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't look like desperation at first, and that's why so many men fall into it without realizing what they're doing. It begins innocently, quick replies, flexible schedules, always making time, always being reachable. On the surface, this looks like interest, consistency, even emotional maturity. But beneath it, over-availability sends a very specific psychological signal. Nothing else competes for my attention. And in human attraction, what feels uncontested rarely feels compelling. Desire is not created by presence alone. It's created by presence that has weight, limits, and meaning. When availability has no cost, it has no tension. And without tension, attraction slowly fades into comfort. The nervous system plays a huge role here. Attraction lives in contrast between closeness and distance, between access and uncertainty. When you are always available, you remove the contrast. There's no emotional spike when you appear because you never truly disappear. There's no anticipation because nothing has to be anticipated. Over time, the interaction becomes emotionally flat. Not bad, not negative, just neutral. And neutrality is far more dangerous than rejection because it keeps you connected without momentum. She doesn't feel pushed away, but she doesn't feel pulled in either. The connection exists, but it doesn't deepen because there's no emotional pressure inviting her to invest more. Overavailability also shifts the power dynamic in subtle ways. When one person is always ready, always responsive, always accommodating, the other person unconsciously becomes the regulator of the connection. She decides when interaction happens, how long it lasts, and how much energy it receives. This isn't something she plans or exploits. It's something the dynamic creates. And when a woman senses that the connection continues regardless of her effort, initiation stops feeling necessary. Why initiate something that's already guaranteed? The human mind doesn't act to preserve what feels secure without contribution. It acts to protect what might be lost. Another overlooked consequence of overavailability is emotional saturation. When there's constant access to someone's thoughts, reactions, and presence, emotional novelty disappears. You stop being experienced as a person with a full life and start being experienced as a channel, always open, always flowing. That saturation dulls emotional response. Your messages don't land with the same impact. Your presence doesn't shift her mood the way it once did, not because you've changed, but because there's no contrast to activate emotional response. Attraction requires rhythm, and overavailability flattens rhythm into monotony. Most damaging of all, overavailability slowly trains you to abandon your own internal pacing. You begin to prioritize responsiveness over authenticity. Instead of reaching out when you feel inspired or grounded, you reach out because you can. Instead of letting moments breathe, you fill them. This creates a subtle loss of self-respect that the other person can feel, even if they can't name it. Attraction isn't just about how someone treats you. It's about how they treat their own time, energy, and attention. When you demonstrate that all of yours is always on offer, you unintentionally communicate that it has little value. And once value perception drops, attraction doesn't disappear dramatically. It quietly goes dormant, waiting for something that reminds her there is more beneath the surface than constant availability. Emotional investment is not a decision people make consciously. It is a response the nervous system makes when something feels meaningful, uncertain, and alive. Most men assume that if they show consistency, loyalty, and effort, emotional investment will naturally follow. But the psychology of investment works in the opposite direction. People invest emotionally when they feel involved, not when they are being taken care of. When everything is offered freely and predictably, the mind relaxes into consumption mode. There is no inner movement, no emotional leaning forward, no sense of participation. Emotional investment requires an internal action, and internal action only happens when there is something unresolved pulling at the person from within. One of the strongest drivers of emotional investment is effort, but this effort must come from her, not you. The brain assigns value based on energy expenditure. When a woman initiates contact, wonders about you, or reaches out first, her mind begins to justify that action. She tells herself a story, often unconsciously, about why she cared enough to do it. That story strengthens emotional attachment. When you remove the need for her to initiate by always being present, always reaching out, you remove the very mechanism that would cause her to invest. She doesn't need to explain her behavior to herself because she hasn't made a meaningful choice yet. Emotional investment grows when a person feels like an active participant rather than a passive recipient. Another key element in emotional investment is uncertainty. This doesn't mean confusion, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability. It means healthy unpredictability rooted in a full life. When she doesn't fully know where she stands at every moment, her mind stays engaged. It checks in, it replays interactions, it fills in gaps. That mental engagement is the seed of emotional attachment. Certainty too early shuts this process down. When everything is clear, available, and guaranteed before emotional depth has formed, the mind stops working for connection. There's nothing to resolve, nothing to earn, nothing to emotionally secure. Emotional investment also depends on boundaries. Boundaries signal self-respect, and self-respect is emotionally attractive because it suggests stability. When a man has boundaries around his time, attention, and energy, it communicates that his inner world is organized and intentional. This invites respect, and respect is a prerequisite for deep emotional investment. Without boundaries, effort becomes invisible. It blends into the background. The woman may enjoy the attention, but enjoyment is not attachment. Attachment forms when attention is experienced as selective, not constant. Finally, emotional investment grows through absence more than presence. Not physical disappearance, but emotional space. Space allows feelings to surface. It gives her room to notice what she misses, what she values, what she reaches for when you're not immediately available. Without space, emotions remain flat and untested. With space, they gain depth and clarity. This is why trying harder rarely increases investment, but stepping back calmly often does. Emotional investment is not something you can force or request. It is something you allow by creating conditions where her emotions have room to move, respond, and choose to engage. High-value men are often misunderstood. People assume they are dominant, emotionally distant, or deliberately withholding. In reality, what separates them is not control over others, but control over themselves. Their behavior is not a strategy designed to provoke a reaction. It is a natural extension of inner stability. When a woman doesn't text first, a high-value man doesn't panic, analyze every delay, or try to correct the situation through more effort. He observes. He notes patterns without attaching his self-worth to them. This emotional neutrality is not indifference. It is grounded confidence. And that groundedness creates a psychological environment where attraction can grow without pressure. One of the biggest differences is that high-value men do not lead with validation seeking. They don't initiate contact to check where they stand emotionally. They initiate when they have something meaningful to share or when connection aligns with their life, not as a way to secure reassurance. This changes the tone of every interaction. Conversations feel lighter, more intentional, less burdened by unspoken need. Women can sense when communication is driven by enjoyment rather than fear, and enjoyment invites reciprocity far more naturally than need ever could. Because he is not chasing emotional confirmation, his presence feels like a choice, not a requirement. High-value men also respect pacing. They understand that emotional connection develops at different speeds for different people, and they don't try to force synchronization. If a woman is slower to initiate, they don't rush to fill the gap. They allow the dynamic to reveal itself. This patience is powerful because it communicates self-trust. It says without words, I don't need to rush intimacy to feel secure. That message creates safety, but it also creates intrigue. When someone is comfortable letting things unfold, it signals that they have options, depth, and a life that isn't hinging on one outcome. Another key difference is how high-value men respond to imbalance. They don't confront it emotionally or complain about effort. They adjust behaviorally. If they notice they are always initiating, they simply initiate less. Not to test her, not to provoke anxiety, but to restore alignment with their own standards. This quiet recalibration is non-confrontational and deeply attractive because it shows self-respect in action. Boundaries expressed through behavior feel more authentic than boundaries expressed through words, and they invite the other person to either step forward or step aside without drama. Most importantly, high-value men remain anchored in their own purpose. Their life has momentum independent of romantic outcomes. Work, growth, friendships, and personal fulfillment are not paused for attention. This doesn't make them emotionally unavailable. It makes them emotionally solid. When a woman interacts with a man like this, she feels that connection with him is an addition to a full life, not the center of it. That energy naturally encourages initiation because it creates a sense of earning access rather than being handed constant availability. Attraction grows not because he is trying to be valued, but because he already values himself in how he lives, moves, and chooses where to place his attention. The shift that changes everything is moving from seeking response to embodying direction. Most men unknowingly orient their behavior around reaction. Did she reply? How fast? With what tone? That orientation places her at the emotional center of the dynamic. When she is the reference point, initiation becomes her responsibility to grant or withhold, and your energy becomes dependent on her choices. The moment you stop seeking response and start embodying direction, the entire dynamic reorganizes itself. Direction means your actions are guided by your values, your priorities, and your inner rhythm, not by her level of engagement. This doesn't reduce interest, it clarifies it. When a man embodies direction, his communication changes subtly but powerfully. He no longer texts to keep the connection alive. He texts to invite someone into a moment of his life. There is movement behind his words. There is intention. His messages feel anchored rather than floating. This creates psychological gravity. Instead of the interaction being about maintaining contact, it becomes about sharing experiences, perspectives, and presence. Women are drawn to movement because movement implies growth. When you are moving forward in your life, emotionally and practically, people naturally lean in to stay connected to that motion. This shift also removes pressure from her nervous system. When she senses that your life is progressing regardless of her response, interaction stops feeling like a responsibility. She no longer feels that her silence will destabilize you or that her attention is required to keep things balanced. That emotional freedom is critical. Desire emerges most easily when it is not burdened by consequence. When she reaches out, it feels like a choice, not an obligation. And choices are far more emotionally reinforcing than duties. Another important aspect of this shift is internal alignment. When you stop chasing initiation, you stop negotiating with yourself. You no longer override your own instincts to maintain connection. You honor your time, your energy, and your emotional boundaries. This internal congruence is felt externally. People respond to coherence even if they can't explain why. When your actions match your inner state, your presence feels trustworthy and solid. That solidity invites curiosity because it stands out in a world full of emotional reactivity and need-based behavior. As you embody direction, space naturally opens in the dynamic. Not forced distance, but organic space created by engagement with your own life. That space activates reflection on her side. She begins to notice your absence, not as loss, but as a question. Where did his attention go? What is he building? Why does his presence feel different now? These questions pull her inward, and that inward movement is what precedes outward action. Reaching out becomes a way for her to re-enter a connection that now feels alive, grounded, and self-sustaining rather than predictable or dependent.